And we are live. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this latest live stream session, which I'm calling the Sales Nerd Series. And I'm excited for my first guest to join us today, which I'll introduce in just a moment. So if you're going to be joining us, please make sure post your questions below. We'll be answering those as we go over the next 30 minutes. And welcome to the sales excellence, the neuroscience and data behind high-performing sales teams. Now, I am delighted to introduce to you all Mr. Ben Tagoe, who is the CEO of Objective Management Group, which if you have heard me talk, if you've seen anything that I've posted about, and I cite OMG, I am citing the 2.4 million salespeople who've been evaluated by OMG over the last 30 years. There's nothing I love more than the data behind all of this, because it really is crucial to help high-performing teams to perform. So Ben, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course, Carol, thank you for having me. I'm really excited. From one sales nerd to another, very excited to be here.
I know I had to put my glasses on so that I completed the entire look here. But Ben, I know that you're always doing some analysis of all of the data that you have at your fingertips, which I'm so delighted that I get to also kind of tie on into that. But you have some interesting data that you've sort of pulled lately around onboarding and the struggles that people have with that. So, and I think some of it hasn't even been published yet. So you all are hearing this before the rest of the world hears it right now. Can you tell me a little bit more about the data that you're seeing in terms of what's getting in the way of teams really performing at their highest points?
Yeah, and you're right. This is hot off the press, not even publicly available. So nothing better in the sales world than brand new and limited availability. So we did some research. So we work with, Carol, as you mentioned, over our 35 years, we've worked with companies assessing 2.4 million salespeople. We evaluate close to 75,000 salespeople and sales candidates each year. And one of the things that we just started doing recently as part of our evaluations when we're onboarding new users is we started asking them about their hiring and onboarding practices, what the company is already doing, just to give us a benchmark for where we're starting from. And so we'll ask some questions like, what kind of turnover are you experiencing right now? Do you have an onboarding plan? How long does your onboarding plan last for? Do you use a scorecard? And the onboarding data is really interesting. We found that the companies that are, when they come and start working with us, we asked them, how long is your onboarding? 64% of the companies that we surveyed said that their onboarding for salespeople lasts for less than a month, for less than 30 days. And really the recommended, if you looked at research from SHRM or ATD or talk to any sales development experts like yourselves, the recommendation is you should be onboarding for at least 90 days. So to see that 2/3 of the companies out there are falling well short of that bar, that was pretty eye-opening.
That is I guess the thing is how big of a deal is onboarding really? Like, what's the impact that you're seeing it have on sales teams? I know with some of the clients that I'm working with that they're seeing, turnovers, they're seeing complacency, they're seeing deals that are stalling and they're not sure why. And it seems like they just keep recycling salespeople, but never actually fixing the root cause of the problem of why they're seeing such turnover.
Carol, that's exactly it. The average turnover for B2B salespeople across industries is about 33%. A third of all salespeople that are hired, by the end of their first year, they are no longer with the company that hired them. And disproportionately, that turnover is happening in the first 90 days. Mm-hmm. And it's you asked about what's the impact of onboarding? Is this just sort of a kind of an academic thing? I was actually just talking recently to a company's head of enablement, and this person expressed that when they made their onboarding structured and took it from just a 3-day, we're going to give you your paperwork, we're going to show you where the water cooler is, we're going to give you some swag, and actually turned it into something that was aligned with the skills and processes that a new seller needs to be coached to in order to complete this. We were just talking about sales cycle, complete their sales cycle effectively. They saw their turnover go from the industry average of 30% to below 10%. So
Wow.
onboarding, and when, we talk a lot about the cost of replacing a hire is 1.5 to 2 times what their salary is. So when you're reducing turnover from 30% to 10%, that has a huge impact on the bottom line of the company.
Yeah. Well, one of the mistakes that I see a lot of business leaders and sales leaders make is that the underestimated cost of a unsuccessful sales hire. Like we've seen the data of 1 to 2 times their base salary, but in sales, that cost is actually much higher because of the missed opportunities, the revenue that you were counting on them to bring in. And so I want to back up just for a second because I get so excited about the new data that you're sharing on onboarding. But one of the things that, like, if we start at the very beginning on how they're hiring salespeople, I can't tell you how many times I've gone into an organization and I ask questions around, what is the criteria for someone to be successful in this role? And they just kind of give me this blank look, like, well, they need to be curious, and they need to be detail oriented, and they need to be critical thinkers. And my questions to them are usually around, have you ever seen a curious salesperson not work out? And if the answer is an overwhelming yes, then maybe this isn't criteria that's going to be predictable of you being able to find the right people in the right role. So using a data-driven and systemized process for hiring to reduce our own biases in the hiring process, not only does it increase diversity and inclusion because you're not looking for that athlete or the person who's just like you. We all have our biases, whether it's with our current team or with hires. And I see companies then start to drop off when, okay, we used an assessment of some type to try to screen our candidates, but we're still seeing this high turnover or this high unsuccess rate. And I think that, to your point, is far too many of them are not looking at not only how they're hiring, and do they even have like a scorecard for hiring? Like, wasn't it like 64%, no, 74% of companies aren't using a scorecard in their hiring process?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
And it's this battle of, well, I think this and I think that. And it's nothing other than guessing at this point. And for a role that is so crucial for a company's livelihood, I can't imagine wanting to guess on that. And then compounding that with the fact that they're not even onboarding them in a sufficient way. I often say, when you start your onboarding with, here's our process, here's our product, here's our CRM system, here's where the water cooler is, here's how to set up your email, and then expect them to have relevant conversations with their buyers. I often say, how you teach your salespeople is how they're going to preach to their buyers. And so if you start off all about your product, then that's what they're going to talk about. And that's why we have the dreaded demo pitch slap that is still prevalent today. So hiring using data, using scorecards, using a systemized process to reduce our own biases, and then structuring our onboarding so that I like to call it embedding and immersing your salespeople in the world of your buyer. And that takes a little bit more effort, more than a little more effort than here's our products and here's the benefits and the features of that. Now go sell it. For even people who are familiar with your industry, it doesn't mean that they're familiar with your particular buyer and your market and your value propositions and positioning statements to those particular buyers. Let's switch a little bit to and make the hopeful assumption that you've hired in the right way, you've onboarded in the right way. There's a dynamic that I'm seeing happening with teams where the pandemic has kind of thrown the in the office up in the air, and some are hybrid, some are completely remote. And some are trying to get their people back in the office. Based on the people that you've talked to, I think one of the questions that I hear a lot is, well, how should we structure it? Should we be hybrid? Should we be in person? Should we be remote? What are your thoughts on that?
As far as whether sellers should be, where the sellers should sit?
Yeah.
I think, Carole, like with the job description and like with the skills that are required, it really depends on what is most appropriate for your company, your company's culture, and also for your go-to-market motion. I mean, look, it's really interesting. I'll talk to companies out there and they say, we've got to hire 30 BDRs. I don't know why they're hiring 30 BDRs, but we've got to hire 30 BDRs. Sorry, shouldn't dunk on companies though. We've got to hire 30 BDRs. And they're going to be sitting in front of the dialer all day. They're going to be researching prospects. They're going to be teeing up automated emails. Oh, and they all have to sit in our offices in this expensive downtown in San Francisco. Why?
Yeah.
And look, there might be good reasons for that, because there are definitely benefits to culture and cohesion onboarding, it's not sufficient just to be in the same place to do successful onboarding, but it kind of helps if you are in the same place in the same time zone. But getting back to my point, the BDRs, your client, your prospect, they are not in your office, right? So if you have a go-to-market motion where you have to be in front of your prospects, you have to be in front of your clients, whether that's at their site or at trade shows or industry events or whatever else, that is going to require kind of your people sitting in a very different location strategy than if everyone's just sitting in front of a screen and just shooting out emails, which you probably can do from, kind of a different setup or different locations than if you need to be in front of your buyer.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I work with a lot of individual salespeople who are considering moving to other companies. And I can't tell you how many times they've come to me and said, well, this was what the ad said. This was what the job description said. And when I got into the role, it was nothing like what they described. And we talk about role misalignment, not just in as far as hybrid work or remote work, but even within the role itself, whether they're going to be handling inbound leads or they're going to be expected to go outbound and actually prospect and find new business. And then to find out that, oh yeah, by the way, we want you to come into the office every day, but for any other reason other than we want to see what it is that you're doing, it creates this disconnect between the experience, the expectation that they had and the experience that they actually get. Which I think is going to contribute more to the turnover of that. And I think it goes back to what are the criteria that you have of a successful salesperson. Interestingly enough, I used to be one of those people that was, I don't understand the reason for us to all have to go through sitting in the traffic and going to the office and doing all of these things. And then I was working with a client who was struggling with the fact that the majority of their sales team was complacent. They weren't doing the follow-up. They weren't, actually getting ahead of what their customers' needs were and anticipating that. They weren't being innovative and creative, which was something that was absolutely critical because in the age of AI, if you're doing IT, for example, then you need to be able to be innovative and creative with their teams. And their teams were all 100% remote. And what was interesting was looking at the neuroscience behind that, because what I found is that when you need teams to be innovative and creative, and I have yet to come across a sales team that there isn't an element of that's required today. When you're working 100% remote, it is actually more difficult for those teams to be innovative and creative because they're not able to collaborate effectively. It's harder for them to actually brainstorm together. And instead, they're just focused on the tasks that they need to do. And what's interesting is that the neuroscience tells us that when people are together and working and learning together, they're also more likely to be innovative and creative together because it creates an actual, what they call synchronicity inside of their brains with each other. It's almost like if you've ever seen a football team that gets together for a huddle, and they're jumping to the same beat and they're moving to the same music and they're kind of pumping each other up. It's an actual neuroscience technique that we can use to actually help our teams to be able to better work together. And especially when you think about the handoff that happens between sales and, say, customer success, or from BDR to salesperson to customer success. One of the things that I ended up recommending for this client was not only did they need to hire, better qualified salespeople and onboard them in a better way, but look at possibly, you can have a hybrid environment if you can hire regionally and bring them in together for certain types of training and workshops and even just building relationships and camaraderie with each other because they're going to have to work together for the betterment of the client, which kind of goes in against the face of everything that I've believed up to this point of remote work is the way to be. And maybe that's my bias speaking because I've been doing it for 20 years. And even putting that into the job description, I think, and the advertisement that people are doing in order to create those kinds of high level of teams. Now, for example, with Objective Management Group, some of you work remote, some of you are in the office. And so it seems like it's a little bit of a hybrid environment. How does that kind of resonate with you?
It resonates a lot. And I've got to say, I love that you came in with your bias or your prior assumption, right? But then you looked at the data and you let the data guide you in a very different direction. I love that. I love that. And I'm curious, actually, from when you think about all B2B selling has become more complex, meaning on the seller side, there are more people. It is more collaborative, right? It's not
Yeah.
just the salesperson going in with their brochure, their pamphlets, or whatever else. They're now bringing in customer success. They're bringing in product. They're bringing in sales engineering. And then on the buyer side, it's more complex as well. We're not just selling to the immediate decision maker. We're selling to a whole group of stakeholders. We're selling to their product team, their tech team, their HR team, whatever else it might be. Do you think that the premium on that alignment, that synchronicity, is kind of getting even greater as selling is becoming more complex?
Yes, because you're right, selling is becoming more complex. There's an average between 5 to 11 decision makers who need to make a decision together. So there's that complexity that's happening because everyone has different priorities. And so if you're all in remote locations and you don't have that synchronicity even between the decision makers, the salesperson's job is to try to create consensus within those decision makers to want to agree on what is the actual problem and what is the best way that we believe that to solve it. And also then dealing with the information overload that they have. One of the worst things that I see happen in sales today is that when you have multiple decision makers and you get off of a sales call and the salesperson sends a follow-up email with a white paper attached. Here's some more information to dump on all of you that you can sort through all of this. And instead of what my colleague Brent Adamson, who I spoke with at Inbound this year, talks about, instead of, if anyone doesn't know who Brent Adamson is, by the way, he's the co-author of the Challenger Sale. And one of the, it's interesting about some of the research that he has coming out is that we have to help our buyers to make sense and make frameworks around how to make these decisions, which is even more difficult to do when we're all working remotely. And in a moment, I'll share some of the tips to make that better. But we do, as salespeople, need to be able to, we still need to get in front of our customers because that's where the chemistry happens, the building of trust happens. And also, if we're going to build that consensus in the decision makers, then and help them to make sense of the information that's being thrown at them so that they can get to the point where they're certain of the value that they're going to get so that they feel comfortable and confident in making the decision. That's where we need to get to in sales today, because AI is just making information more readily available. But this question that still exists in our buyers and decision makers' minds is, how does this relate to what I'm doing and trying to achieve right now? And what's interesting about all of this is that we see that 40-60% of deals end in no decision. And it's not because we haven't found the pain and we haven't made them feel that pain. It's because they don't feel confident that if they make a decision, it's going to lead to a better outcome. In the jolt effect, they call it a commission bias, where we would rather sit in a painful status quo right now than we would making the effort to do a decision to make something happen and either get the same results as before or get even worse results. Like, there's nothing worse than trying to fix something and then just making it worse. Like, we're trying to renovate our kitchen right now, and my husband is studying to be an electrician. And at one point, I didn't have hot water or a sink for 3 months. And it was painful. And I had to finally go and hire someone who was an expert to help us to figure this out. But we sat in that painful status quo for 3 months because we didn't know if there was going to be someone who could actually help us do this in a way that was going to be in a timely way. And so I'm like, 3 months later, I'm like, all right, in order for us to stay married, I'm hiring someone to figure it out for us. But I even had an experience recently where I was doing a workshop with a group of fractional CFOs. And it was interesting is that we all sat down to dinner, and it was one of those places where everyone had shared plates. Now imagine a group of strangers who have never met each other before having to sit down at dinner and collectively decide what it is that we're all going to eat for dinner for the next 2 hours. With all of the dietary restrictions and likes and dislikes, this is exactly what our buyers today are going through, is how do we as salespeople help them to feel confident in their making their decisions? Not just are we making sure that the pain is painful enough for them that they scream uncle and do whatever it is that we ask of them. It's not how selling works anymore.
No. And Carole, I love where you're going with this, because this is actually exactly where I'm just going to riff off this, which is, there's this idea or kind of bias around the pushy salesperson. And I think a lot of that comes from behaviors or kind of, poor demonstration of poor selling skills. But what sales is not a dirty word, right? I really, really believe that. And one of the things that the salesperson does, and that's increasingly more critical, is they help their buyers and sometimes even their own companies create clarity in situations of super high ambiguity
Right.
and super high indecision, right? And the analogy I often use is the salesperson is a facilitator. They are also the driver of a group in a complex sale, of a group decision-making process. It's like being in college and you got to order pizza for the party, right? Or like being at your dinner and you've got to figure out what small plates you're ordering.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe one person wants anchovies, one person wants pineapple, someone else is allergic to pineapple. And nothing's getting done, right? Everyone's just kind of sitting around looking at each other. And there's always that one person, thank goodness for them, because otherwise you would have starved in college. There's always that one person who kind of is able to pull everyone together and say, okay, fine, here's the math. You're going to need an average of 4 slices. We need to order 8 boxes of pizza. Make sure that one doesn't have any pineapple on it. Put the pineapple on that one. Split the mushrooms on this one. And they're the one who actually gets it done. And in our world, in our context, and for buyers, that is what the salesperson is doing, right?
Yeah.
They are the one who's driving that process forward.
They're
and again,
we as salespeople, we are change agents. We are the one who are helping our buyers to manage change.
Totally right. And getting back to your point around synchronicity, and you have to have a certain kind of empathy and a kind of a heightened emotional awareness in order to be able to drive that process, drive that change effectively.
Yeah. And I think you just got to the crux of all of this, is because we're asking salespeople who are hopefully in the right role, that they know that they're qualified to do. They've been onboarded in a way. They're getting continual training and coaching from their managers who have been taught how to train and coach, and do so a certain percentage of the time, at least 50%. And what happens though, when those things don't happen, when those don't come into play, what ends up happening is that we're putting even more emotional stress on our salespeople, because they have to try and figure it out for themselves, and they're under the pressure to meet a number, or they're going to lose their jobs. And what it does is creates what I call emotional involvement, which we measure for at Objective Management Group. And what that prevents a salesperson from doing is asking really good questions, actively listening, not just listening in order to respond. And I think it's like 63% of salespeople today struggle with this because of all of the dynamics of how they're hired, how they're onboarded, how they're coached and trained. And that's why we have this perception of sales today of being icky. There's a survey data that came out from LinkedIn that I talked about in my book, Buyer First. They had a Buyer First survey, and they asked buyers, they asked salespeople, how many of you put your buyer's interest first? And 65% of salespeople, of course, I put my buyers first. Like, that's my role. That's my job. But when they asked buyers that, 77% said, no, they don't put us first. Wow. They give us the wrong information. They're not listening to us. They don't understand. And when they went further and asked hiring managers, what are the top 5 qualities that you look for in a salesperson? Active listening was listed last. When they asked buyers what they value in a salesperson, active listening was listed first. So there is this huge discrepancy between what buyers want and value in salespeople and how we're hiring them. And this is a huge problem, but I also see this as a massive opportunity for us to differentiate ourselves, especially in the age of AI. And I'm gonna go off on a rant a little bit about AI, because I was at Inbound last week. It was the topic on everybody's mind, is how is AI going to impact sales? And the thing is that when you look at the neuroscience of how we manage change, it is our social connections. Our brains are social. And so it's that human connection that happens that helps us to manage change. And that is what we're doing in sales, is we're selling change and helping them to manage that change. And that's not something an AI bot is able to do yet, is to create that chemical reaction that happens between human to human to help them feel confident that they're doing the right thing, that this is something that they're capable of doing. Yes, AI can help us in research and insights and those types of things, but it's not going to, at this point, replace the need for a human being to connect with another human being, because our brains are wired to be social. And I think this goes back to the remote work as well, because what the neuroscience says is that when we are remote and we're isolated, we're lonely. Like, we saw all of this happen during the pandemic of, people's mental health having such a major crisis, because loneliness to our social brains is the same as physical pain to us. And so when you're thinking in a sales situation where, you know, I'm in a role that I'm not qualified for, this isn't exactly what they sold me when I accepted the job. I got onboarding that, well, doesn't really exist. Now I'm under pressure to perform, and I'm working remotely by myself, trying to figure it all out. It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And it's interesting. You know, we did some research around CEOs. The question that we ask ourselves all the time is, do I have the right people in the right roles? Right.
Right.
And you know, obviously made quite famous with Good to Great from a couple of years ago or a few decades ago. Weirdly enough, CEOs don't really ask that question about salespeople that often. Which they should. It is the most, like you mentioned, is the most critical, it's the revenue driving role, but rarely do they ask themselves about alignment. How do I know that? I know that because it's actually one of the questions that we will ask our users. Do you have the right salespeople in the right role? And we went back and we looked at the results of that particular analysis. About 2/3 of the companies in our database that we surveyed have most of their sellers in the wrong role, meaning they do not have the skills that the job description requires, or they do not have the previous work experience that the job description requires. 2/3 of companies have more than half of their teams in the wrong role. So when you think about the frustration that you feel, and then you compound inappropriate or inadequate onboarding, and you think about the frustration that you just described, sellers are going through, trying to be change agents and be facilitators when they do not have the tools, or when what the requirements that they need for the job were misrepresented, and now they're in there and they're not able to effectively operate. It's a huge challenge for our industry. But also, to your point, it is a huge source of opportunity, because if you can get that right, and if you can build that alignment, we see like a 2x difference in terms of revenue performance and quota attainment, and also in retention too.
Yeah. It also, someone had just commented that, being together in person, it's also a culture issue. And, that's the other thing that I took the neuroscience class on, what we really focused in on is that, wrong people, wrong roles, the impact that has, remote work versus hybrid work versus in-person work, but also the impact that it has on culture. And it's a company's culture and their attitude towards sales has humongous impact on the ability of that team to be able to be a high performing team. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to leave everyone with just a few tips. Is if you are in a hybrid role, you are still doing Zoom meetings with your clients and your buyers and your teams, there are some things that you can do to better connect with people. One of those is looking into the camera as if you were looking into someone's eyes. One of my colleagues, Julie Hansen, has a course about and a book called Look Me in the Eye. And what's interesting about this is that when we look people in the eye, or we feel like people are looking directly at us, it actually releases dopamine in our brains, which is a neurotransmitter, which is basically our brain's way of communicating with the other parts of our brain. And it comes from the part of our brain where we build relationships and trust. And so if you're in an environment where you're hybrid or you are remote, looking into the camera helps the other person on the other side feel that dopamine. But then also your facial expressions, your hand expressions, your body language, because they can only see you from here up, has a major impact on their ability to be able to connect with you, versus if you're like this, yep, that's really interesting. Doesn't quite resonate. Ben, thank you so much for joining for this and nerding out with me on the data. Any final thoughts that you want to leave with people as they start going into the last quarter of this year, preparing for 2025? One thing that you would leave with sales leaders that are listening on?
It would just be that. Well, first of all, Carole, thank you for having me. This is so much fun. I love nerding out with you and nerding out with all of our partners. The last thing is what I just shared before, which is focus on alignment. Part of the reason why sales experiences such misalignment is because it is the role that has to undergo the most change. Companies change their go-to-market strategies way more often than they change what their accounting processes are,
Right.
or how their tech teams are working together. So those roles, it's quite appropriate that you will have kind of a static set of requirements. But in selling, it's so dynamic. Think about how, if you're a sales leader or a CEO out there, think about how often you've presented a new go-to-market strategy to your board or to your leadership team. And then ask yourselves, when I did that, did we have a conversation about what are the skills that are going to be required and what's the culture that's going to be required in order to affect this strategy? Chances are you didn't, and that's a real opportunity for you.
And any kind of change within an organization is stressful. And as you said, sales is the one thing that is going through constant change. So not only are we having to manage the change in the environments that we're in, but then we have to be able to remain emotionally even keeled enough to then help our buyers to manage their particular change. And the social ties that we need to create in order to do that within our teams and with our buyers is can't be stressed enough. Human beings need other human beings. I think Libby was the one that said that, we need those water cooler conversations. We need to be able to bounce those ideas off of people. Like, am I thinking about this the right way? And checking our biases against what other people's are. The value of that, I think, is innumerable, because if you think about how we are interacting in our own environments, that's how our sellers are going to then behave with their buyers. And so creating a culture that is not only diverse and inclusive, but also structured in a way that we have scorecards, we have processes in place to do this. Otherwise, it's like trying to walk through the woods without a trail or a path or a map, and looking at the moss on the trees if you really understand which way it is that you're going.
Well put.
Ben, thank you so much for joining me. Everyone, make sure that you follow Ben on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, definitely reach out to us. But thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Carole.
Thanks, Ben. Bye.